We will take you to several stops in southern New Jersey, all of which you can visit yourself and learn even more. These stops include our very own exhibit at Tuckerton Seaport, the Stafford Township Museum, where you can see artifacts of the original railroad, and the Jersey Shore Live Steam, where we will ride a 1/8 scale train.
Hello everyone, my name is German Georgieff and I'm a naturalist with the Ocean County Department of Parks and Recreation, currently working at Wells Mills Park in Waretown, and I live in Little Lake Harbor, only a few minutes from the Tuckerton Seaport. And today we're going to talk about the Tuckerton Railroad and visit a few places where you can still see things that remain of the railroad. No matter where you are in New Jersey, or even the United States for that matter, you can be near old abandoned railroads, and hunting for remains of these can be a great opportunity for recreation. Sometimes the clues are subtle and other times they're more obvious, like the names of the roads that you're on. Here we're at the corner of Station Road and Diamond Road, which is named after the crossing diamond where the two train tracks would cross. So this is obviously a great clue that we're near where we want to be. Today we're at the location of the Tuckerton Railroad, one of the two endpoints in Whiting, and we are going to visit some spots here and other locations where you can still see remains of the railroad. The Tuckerton Railroad was 29 miles long. Of the three railroads in Ocean County, it was the only one that existed totally in Ocean County, and it went from Whiting, where we are today, down to Tuckerton. And it connected here in Whiting with the New Jersey Central and with the Pennsylvania Railroad. So those were the lifelines to the outside world for the Tuckerton Railroad. So we're standing in front of an interpretive panel erected by Eagle Scout candidate Sean Rembach in 2013. And this gives you a little bit of the history of this site. This is an image taken from an aircraft in the 1950s. In this aerial photograph, we can see the remains of the three railroads that were here. You can see the Tuckerton Railroad right-of-way. At the time this image was taken, the tracks had been removed for quite a long time. The turntable pit next to which we're standing now. You can see the Pennsylvania Railroad, which went from Camden to Ocean Gate, and the New Jersey Central Railroad, which went from Jersey City all the way down to Bayside on the Delaware Bay. This is an image of one of the locomotives on the turntable. The nickname was Armstrong turntable because these were manually turned by hand using a crank and gears as opposed to a motorized turntable, which existed later on. In this image, we see two track diagrams, one from the 1890s and one from the 1920s. In the 1890s, it was before the turntable was installed. So if they wanted to change the direction of the Tuckerton Railroad locomotive, it would have to pull onto one of the other adjacent railroads, back up, and then pull forward again. So it was reversing direction. In 1913, they added the turntable so they could put the locomotive on the turntable and it could be rotated, and then it would be pointed in the opposite direction and it would go back onto the tracks at the other end of the train. The paved roadway that we're viewing was once the right-of-way of the Tuckerton Railroad heading south towards Tuckerton. After it was abandoned, it was paved over and it became an automobile road known as Station Road. We're standing in front of the ruins of the railroad station at Whiting. This was actually one of 5 stations that were at this location. The first 2 were a little bit to the north of us when the Raritan and Delaware Bay Railroad was the only line here. That later became the New Jersey Central. After the Tuckerton Railroad and Pennsylvania Railroad were extended to this location, they built a new station at this current location that served all 3 railroads. The station master and his family lived in the upper floor, and they would control the switches that would divert traffic from one train track to another, and also handle the ticket sales and freight needs. The last station of the 3 on this site was built in 1898, and it lasted up until about 1950 and was abandoned shortly afterwards. The date on this sign says 1950, but it was used for a few years after that before abandonment. The trains carried a variety of merchandise as well as passengers. Usually freight trains and passenger trains would be separate, especially in the later days. But in the earlier years, it wouldn't have been unusual for a train to carry both freight and passengers on the same train. A passenger train would also have a baggage car, so people could have their luggage and other items that they carried with them, especially fishing and hunting equipment, which was more popular back in those days. They would be carried in a separate car. The passenger trains would also typically contain a mail car. Back when the days of mail being carried by train was a more common thing. Right now we're standing beside the remains of the old Whitting railroad station, and we're looking to the west along the Pennsylvania Railroad right-of-way, which has been abandoned since the 1950s. Those utility poles are right on the right-of-way. The tracks going from left to right immediately in front of us is the old Jersey Central line, abandoned in the 1980s. And it was only carrying freight at that time. It hadn't carried passengers since about 1940. We're looking to the south along the old New Jersey Central lines, which eventually became Conrail in 1976. There's been some recent work on this line to remove the vegetation and other items blocking it in anticipation of hauling sand and gravel up to northern New Jersey for a construction project. We are lucky to have 3 stations still in existence from the Tuckerton Railroad. The first 2, located in Barnegat and Barnegat Light, are now private dwellings. The third, where we're at now, is the Manahawkin Station. This is owned by the Stafford Historical Society and was moved from its original location on the east side of Route 9 in 1990. Often historical buildings need to be moved when the owners of the property have another use for that property. There are a number of historic railroad artifacts located at this location, small and large. The largest is an old passenger car. While this car is painted as the Tuckerton Railroad and lettered as such, it actually was one of the railroad cars from the New Jersey Central Railroad. And it was located at Earl Naval Weapons Station, and it was used as a classroom for the Naval Sea Cadets. It was no longer needed, so it was acquired by the Stafford Historical Society and moved here, and now serves as a classroom and a meeting location. The other 2 remaining stations from the Tuckerton Railroad have had additions or other modifications to make them more useful as residences, while this one is still in its original condition. This station now functions as one of the Historical Society's museums, which it has several of. This one is dedicated mainly to railroad artifacts and photographs. Like most small historical societies, the operating hours can change from time to time and from different times of the year, so you would want to check with the Historical Society for interior access to the station. But this is part of a public park that you can come and enjoy the grounds and outside portion of the station at any time. People traveling on the Tuckerton Railroad going north would typically start into the Tuckerton Station and come north, stopping here at Manahawkin if they needed. Otherwise, they would continue on to Barnegat. Then once they got to Waretown, the railroad tracks would turn to the northwest and head towards Whitting. Some of the other artifacts that you can feature here that are stored outdoors and can be seen anytime you visit are this old crossing diamond, which is a piece of track where 2 railroads crossed each other. This was located at Whitting, where the Pennsylvania Railroad crossed the New Jersey Central, and it saw countless numbers of trains which crossed over it. When the Pennsylvania Railroad took its tracks out of service in the 1950s, this piece of track was replaced with some straight pieces and was no longer needed. It was just dragged off into the woods nearby. When that piece of woods was turned into a paved road, the section of rail was rescued from people who might take it for scrap metal and brought down here to the Historical Society's grounds and can now be enjoyed by countless people to learn about its history. The other items here are these concrete piers. There's several of them here. These once supported a water tower, which steam locomotives needed to keep themselves going, to generate steam to move the wheels. And this was located on the section of track that left the main line and went towards Long Beach Island. Many people driving over Route 72 to Long Beach Island do not realize that they're actually driving on the old Tuckerton Railroad. If we step over here, you can see a section of a freight car. This is actually a company, and this would have been mounted on either end of a boxcar or passenger car, and it allowed two trains to be connected together and easily disconnected. Soon after the Tuckerton Railroad was built in 1871, a spur was built in Tuckerton to the bay, where small steamboats owned by the railroad would take passengers to Long Beach Island. Later on, when an all-rail route was desired, in Manahawkin, a trestle was built connecting the mainland with Long Beach Island, and then rails went south to Beach Haven and north to Barnegat Light. So now people could more easily access the shore communities. And the railroads were actually tremendously important to the development of the Jersey Shore. Before the railroads, only the wealthy could afford the long sea voyage or overland trip from the areas that they lived in the big cities to the shore to fish, swim, duck hunt, and pursue other activities. With the advent of the railroads, it was only a few hours from the major metropolitan areas, and even working class people could enjoy time at the shore. Also, the railroads brought in building materials and shipped out agricultural products like blueberries and cranberries, and the prey for the hunters like shorebirds and waterfowl, which many people made a living at one time. And all of these things were very important to the growth of our area. Here at Heritage Park in Manahawkin, they also have this small duck boat on display. This is a unique design called the Barnegat Bay Sneak Box, which was invented by Hazelton Seamen in West Creek. And it's designed for duck hunting in the shallow waters of Barnegat Bay and the lower bays. And duck boats such as this, and also duck decoys, would have been one of the more unique items that were shipped out of the area on the Tuckerton Railroad and would have found their way to duck hunting areas all over the country. In fact, a combination of Harry Shor's being a prolific duck decoy carver and the Tuckerton Railroad made Tuckerton the duck decoy capital of the United States in some people's estimation because of those two factors. One of the biggest Barnegat Bay sneak box makers was the Perrine factory in Barnegat, and countless Barnegat Bay sneak boxes would have been shipped out of the Barnegat Station. If you visit the Tuckerton Seaport, you can see a recreation of the Perrine boat works, and you could also see what has been considered the largest collection of Barnegat Bay sneak boxes on Earth at our museum. We're now in Tuckerton, near the beginning of the Tuckerton Railroad. And what's interesting is that for a relatively small railroad, the Tuckerton Railroad still has 3 of these structures that's behind me still in existence. These were coal trestles, and they were designed to work with a type of freight car called a hopper. And hopper cars were loaded from the top and unloaded from hatches below. And they could be used for any loose material like gravel, stone, even corn or other grains. In this case, they were used for coal. And it was constructed as a ramp, so the hopper car could be backed up the ramp over the various bins, and then the coal could be dumped inside them and then would be sold to customers or used for the railroad's own use. This one was used in conjunction with a store that sold coal to the public. We're now on the grounds of the Greenwood Cemetery in Tuckerton. This cemetery was in existence when the Tuckerton Railroad was first built and started operations in 1871. And the railroad purchased land from the cemetery to build their terminal facilities. These facilities included a passenger station, freight station, 2 engine houses with a turntable in between, and also this coal trestle. Unlike the coal trestle that we previously saw, this one was just for the use of the railroad for their steam engines. And you could see the series of concrete piers, the ones that are not painted green, which would have held rails, which when it went higher as you went towards the background, until it was high enough to dump coal within the bins. When the Tuckerton Railroad went out of business in 1940, this land was sold back to the cemetery, and the cemetery now uses it to store landscape materials and debris. They also enclosed the last 3 piers with cinder blocks to make a shed to store their landscaping equipment. And of course, being a cemetery, this area is open to the public, so you can not only come and see the structures related to the railroad, but there are also some famous individuals buried here, 2 of which are associated with the topics related to the Tuckerton Seaport. They are famous decoy carvers. Harry Shorts, who is probably one of the more famous decoy carvers in the world, is buried here. And in another carver who lived only a few houses down the street, Samuel Turney Smith, is also buried here. And I'm sure there are many others who were either baymen or decoy carvers, or have some other notoriety in our history that are resting in peace here. This is another artifact of the Tuckerton Railroad that's a little bit harder to find, and also perhaps less safe because of the underbrush and risk from ticks and tick-borne illnesses that you should always be aware of. But this is the remains of the freight house. So most of the towns that had a stop for the railroad would have a passenger station and also a freight house or freight station, where items that were being delivered would be held until the purchaser could pick them up. And there would have been a structure on top of this platform, which is long deteriorated, and all that is left is the creosoted pilings and timbers.
My name is Vincent Lutz, and I live in Carteret, New Jersey, which is up near Newark. And I've been a member of this organization for close to 13 years now, and I became the president about 4 years ago. The organization is in a township park on 64 acres in New Gretna, Bass River. We are a 1/8 scale steam, battery operated, and some gasoline powered engines, locomotives. We operate weekends only because we're all volunteers, and we open from 9 o'clock Saturday and Sunday till 4 o'clock on Saturday and 3 o'clock on Sunday. Well, they learn a little bit about what the Tuckerton Railroad was, and that's what we're trying to recreate here in the 1/8 scale. So when this is all complete, there'll be actually 4.5 real miles to make up the 34 miles that the Tuckerton Railroad used to be. And we have several steam locomotives, which are what people really learn about, is what steam did for the railroads and this country to make it what it is. Well, railroads came about at the same time, or just a little after, the canal system, when everything was moved by barges down the Erie Canal and all the different canals in the U.S. The railroads came along and kind of put the canal boats out of business, and everything that you could think of is moved by railroads. There are many railroads, deceased railroads now, but what they call fallen flags, that ran all over this country, and there are many different rail widths. Standard rail is 4 foot 8.5 inches, and there were some railroads that had 6 foot gauge between the railroads, and then others that went down as small as 24 inches.
The passenger service was actually created by the 2 gentlemen who started the railroad to get people to come, because Long Beach Island at that time was kind of like the Bahamas in the 1700s, 1800s. There was a small gauge railroad because it was then no cars, no roads. They had a small gauge railroad on LBI. So what people would do is like a 2 to 2.5 day stagecoach ride. After they got across the Delaware from Philly, they'd go by stagecoach down and end up at the Tuckerton Seaport, and then get on a steamship and go to LBI and spend a Bahama weekend there or whatever. So when the Atlantic City line went in, people said we should have one here. So the two gentlemen from Tuckerton, who I can't pronounce their names unfortunately, they built the railroad from Tuckerton to Whiting's, New Jersey. Whiting's, New Jersey was the northern terminus, and it met the Pennsylvania Railroad, which meant once you changed trains, you could go all the way back to Camden, or from Camden to Jackson area, which is Whiting's, and then come down here. They put you on the steamship again, but it cut like a 2.5 day ride on a dusty stagecoach down to a few hours on a train. They did eventually start hauling freight. They hauled seafood and whatnot, because all along the lines, townships needed, they saw the seafood come in. They put themselves out of business actually hauling the gravel to build Route 9 because cars came of age. So they made some money. They didn't make some money, but it was a pretty neat railroad for its time, and that's how we ended up here, trying to keep that alive. But there is a lot online about the railroad. It's amazing amount of things that you can read about this railroad for having been, what, 40 years? 1870 to just before World War II, correct?
Yeah.
Tuckerton steamship lines, and that was how you got to LBI. And then you took the little train up to Barnegat or down to the other end, and they said, let's do something different. And then eventually they did put the railroad bridge across first to LBI, and then they started making service. Tuckerton Railroad actually contracted with the Pennsylvania Railroad to run the trains over to LBI, and there was a big storm that came. They got their loco out, and the bridge went down in the storm, and that was the last rail to the island. And then they actually built the bridge and the causeways that we have now, and you can start driving your car. So yeah, it was a lot different back then. Cars weren't of age, so you know, the train, like Vinny said, the train moved everything. The train made America, really did. Some tickets from the 1800s that people donated, real ones, to us, and we have redone them, so now everybody that comes for a ride gets a ticket. We punch your ticket, get your safety orientation first on the train, and then we punch your tickets, and you have a souvenir. Top half goes home with you to show your friends that you went on a train ride.
Hi, we're the Regals. We live in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. We discovered the railway here a couple of weeks ago actually, and we just recently decided to become members so that we can help support the railway. And we're here today. We did a little bit of cleanup around the park, and we took a couple of train rides, and we plan on coming back next summer on the weekends. Although they are open all year long, we may come out for the Christmas lights as well as in the spring to enjoy the railway as the snow melts away.
I like because they drawing. I like about the child of the steel balls. I like to go camping and go trick-or-treating.
We've been camping for a couple of years. My husband's been camping his whole life, but we recently started camping in this area and checking out all the cool places in the area, different restaurants and different spots to take boat rides like the Seaport.
Boat tours, yeah.
And boat tours.
See the different birds.
Go for hikes.
And we also like to go around the beach.
Islands.
And we like to go to play every day.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of people camping this
And
year.
also
Campgrounds
I made some new friends.
Hello everyone, my name's Delaney and I'm currently a student at Stockton University. I'm also currently a tour guide and educator at the Tuckerton Seaport. Today we'll be looking at the Tuckerton Seaport's exhibit on the Tuckerton Railroad. So railroads are very important. They were started in the United States in the 1800s. It was right around the Industrial Revolution, and it was very revolutionary for what was going on at the time. They were helping transport and connect new territories to seaboard locations. It was connecting not only people, but also the freight and trade goods that were being traded at the time. From the 1830s to the 1860s, the idea of building the railroad accelerated very quickly. When people think of railroads and train stations, they typically think of big cities, but Tuckerton actually had a railroad of its own. From the 1830s to the 1860s, the idea of the railway accelerated very quickly. Back then, there were no cars. We didn't have roads, and well, we had roads, but they were meant for carriages and horse and buggy, so we didn't have cars back then. So the railway was very important. It connected people to the new territories, and it was very important to the area at the time. The Tuckerton Railway operated from 1871 to 1936. It would bring people all the way from Philly or from Atlantic City. It would bring people to Tuckerton. Sometimes you could travel from Tuckerton all the way up to Whiting, New Jersey. But if you stopped in Tuckerton, you could take the steamship, which was known as the Manahawkin 1, which is what our ferry is named after, all the way over to Long Beach Island. Because if you remember, at that time, we didn't have a bridge. We didn't have the cars going over. All we had was that steamship connecting people from here to the island. Not only were trains bringing people to and from places, they were also bringing ideas to and from places. There was a train known as the Blue Comet that was coming from Central Jersey that would bring newspapers to Tuckerton. There were areas of Tuckerton that weren't very populated and didn't have a lot of information going on over there at the time. So the train would come by and it would drop off newspapers like the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it would bring new ideas to the area that no one had ever seen at the time. Local legend states that when the Blue Comet would come by, to show their appreciation, the people of Tuckerton would bring baskets full of fruits and fresh-picked berries and bring it to the crew that were operating the Blue Comet. But we don't know if that's actually true, because some people have stated otherwise, but that's just what the legend states. So this is a map of where the Tuckerton Railroad was. Right here is where the passenger station was, so people could get loaded on there and travel to other places or get dropped off. And it would travel on its way up. There was the turntable, so it could switch sides to wherever it wanted to go. It could travel up to the feeding grain, so it could drop off food and other things. Or it could travel down and go to the lumber mill and drop off or pick up different lumber. Seafood like oysters, clams, and mussels were very important to this area. Not only was it a local trade, but once the railroad came in, it became a huge export to the area. So right here we're looking at a receipt that actually showed that we were selling oysters and clams to other areas of the world. On loan from the Tuckerton Historical Society, this ledger, 6 feet wide when opened, is the only known record of the monthly ticket sales of the Tuckerton Railroad from 1872 to 1891. This book was given to the Tuckerton Historical Society by Robert Farrell on January 23, 2017, in James Ested's honor after Mr. Ested's death. Mr. Ested gave it to Robert Farrell in the late 1960s. Mr. Ested procured the ledger in the old Tuckerton Railroad station after it was abandoned. John Brinkman, who wrote The Tuckerton Railroad, A Chronicle of the Transport to the New Jersey Seashore, the definitive book on the history of the railroad, used this book in his research. A fun fact about standardized time: the railroads are what standardized time in the United States. On November 18, 1883, the railroads of North America set a standard time for all trains to address the danger. Industrial America grew around the railroad time system. Factories operated on this standard time, developing punch clocks to monitor and schedule work. Prior to the creation of the railroad, people would typically take stagecoaches to travel to and from places, which typically would take days and were only typically used by the wealthier people or people who were traveling for work. But because of the railroad, people could travel to places like New York, Newark, Elizabeth, New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton, and all the way to Philadelphia. There was also a railway in Long Beach Island, known as the Long Beach Railroad Company. During the latter years of the 19th century, savvy Long Beach Island developers recognized the need for efficient and affordable transportation to keep competitive in the rising vacation and resort industries of the Jersey Shore. In May of 1886, there was also a trestle bridge built from Manahawkin to Long Beach Island to connect people that way as well. We are now in Tuckerton Seaport's Folk Art 101 exhibit, and right behind me we have one of the folk art pieces. This piece was created by Dennis Seeley in 1990. Right in the corner of this painting, you can see where he signed it. This painting is actually a collage that features three-dimensional items that give the artwork in depth. It shows two forms of mass transportation that were bringing people to and from Long Beach Island. So here you can see the original Manahawkin 1, which was a steam-powered boat that would pick people up from the railway from Edge Cove and bring people over to LBI. And then you also have the railway over here that was connected by a trestle bridge over to LBI that people could also take. In this painting, we can see the original Tucker's Island lighthouse in the far right corner over here. While this lighthouse doesn't exist anymore, we have an almost exact replica of the lighthouse at the Tuckerton Seaport. This lighthouse offered safety and protection to a lot of fishermen and those on ships. It would guide people to Tucker's Island, which was located after the southern point of Holgate, which is the most southern end of LBI. In the painting, we can see all of LBI, and all the way in the far left corner you can see Barnegat Light itself, which is where that railway is connecting to. So the painting, which is actually a collage, features that three-dimensional look to it. So if you get closer to it and actually look at it from the side, you can see how all those wood pieces were actually glued on to give it that depth. We're here in the Folk Art 101 exhibit in the Tuckerton Seaport. Just like that painting we were just looking at, all these other pieces in the Seaport are also created by folk artists that live in the South Jersey region.
Another way you can learn about the local history of the Tuckerton Railroad is to visit the Barnegat Branch Rail Trail. This walking trail will eventually stretch over 16 miles of the former railroad. Currently, you can enjoy about 11 miles between Barnegat, Forked River, Bayville, and Beechwood. As you're walking the trail, you'll notice some signs and information that you can look at and learn about its history, and even some artifacts of the original railroad. For instance, at the start of the rail trail in Barnegat, you can see some of the original tracks of the Tuckerton Railroad.